I have been sifting through memories for the last few weeks because I am a daughter preparing for a graveside service in April and a larger memorial in May. And my goal is now to process what life with my parents was really like, what core things I need to hold on to, and what things I don't any longer need. A lot of small memories that you don't know you filed away will just pop up when you do this. I remember one night, my mom was driving me and my brother home from our great-grandmother's house near Turnertown on Highway 64. She turned left onto 64 as usual to go back towards our house, but then another really quick left onto a county road. Now she'd normally have, driven through town, all a very well, lighted, appointed route that we knew. But then she didn't, and I was immediately interested. I just remember this change of routine as, oh, this is cool. My brother was immediately suspicious. He's 4 years younger, and I don't know, none of us were teenagers yet, is the closest I can get in my mind to how old we were. This is back in the days before GPS or cell phones, and so my mom just had a hunch that the county roads connected. She literally had a hunch that if I just keep winding away, and using compass directions, I will end up from the Tyler side of Henderson to the Longview side of Henderson. She just knew she could get us home using only the tiny country roads, oil tops, we used to call them. And she did it. That woman was very, very good at driving and navigating, but as you might suspect, it took longer than usual. Kind of a lot longer than usual. It involved many sharp curves in places with no shoulder. There were cars suddenly coming at us with their high beams on, and there were trees suddenly hanging low over us in the dark. You get the picture. We arrived safely at our house, and I said something like, "Oh, that was the most fun I've ever had coming home from Nanny's. Let's do it again." And my brother said, "Are you kidding me? We are lucky to be alive." And both of us were right. Both of us were right. The way we interpret events depends on the eyes we look through. That is a perspective we're going to need to tackle one of Jesus's greatest hits today. 2 Sunday mornings away from resurrection with a lot more story to tell, I feel really good about stopping here for a day so that we might watch Jesus turn over some tables. This story, which you've probably, if you haven't heard, you've heard it referenced, turning over tables. Jesus flips tables. It's in every gospel, all 4 of them. And it's in almost the same time in 3 out of the 4. Only in John, who tells the story his own way, does this day come early in Jesus' ministry. Everywhere else, it comes at the end, which is kind of where we are in space and time as we're remembering. Our best chronologies put these events in the very last week of Jesus' life. As he enters Jerusalem on a donkey, he visits the temple that very same evening, and then he comes back to the temple the next morning. He's in the city because it's festival time in Judaism, specifically the Feast of Passover. So Jesus would have been just one of tens of thousands of observant Jews streaming into Jerusalem. I've read anywhere from 100,000 to 150,000 extra people in a city that held maybe 25,000 usually. All of them coming to celebrate Passover, and all of those visitors, pilgrims, we might call them, coming specifically to visit the hub of Jewish life, not just in Jerusalem, but anywhere, the temple in Jerusalem. The temple was Capitol building and holy shrine, all wrapped in one. The temple complex was the center of Jewish commercial activity. It was the center of their identity, political and religious. It was the center of their memory, a site of their achievement, something of architectural wonder. Just all around, it was the most powerful symbol of belonging and identity if you were a person of God. And this complex made a fortune off the poor in the name of that same God. Each year at Passover, people had to do two things in order to access worship at the temple. They had to pay a temple tax, and they had to make an animal sacrifice. The tax was actually an annual fee for property upkeep, like an HOA, like dues to the temple. But people who didn't travel there often and didn't live close by would only come to Jerusalem once a year. So their dues now coincide with their required sacrifice. Got to pay for both at once. And as to that, people had to buy either a lamb or a dove at the temple. Couldn't bring your own. Couldn't pack a sack lunch of sacrificial dove. You had to buy the ones at the temple because they were raised in the right way and, clean enough to give up to God. But worse than that, besides the cost of the animal, the money that people brought into Jerusalem with them wasn't directly useful to make this purchase. Their Roman coins had the face of Caesar stamped on them. So helpfully, the temple authorities set up a bank to exchange this idolatrous money, these Roman coins, for temple coins. And this is very much like the olden days at Chuck E. Cheese when you'd take a real US quarter and then you would have to get a gold token to go play the games. And sometimes it was not a one-to-one transaction. Often, the exchange rate for your Roman coins into temple shekels cost you money. There was a fee. Religious custom obligated these people to make the sacrifices, but the cost of them had grown outrageous over time because opportunists just weren't making fair deals. The requirements at play right now had nothing to do with God's core law. This is not God was wrong. This is people had created extra rules. And their rules didn't even represent all of Judaism. They didn't represent the will of all Jews. The temple situation had become this kind of unholy marriage between the leading class of an oppressed people and the ruling power of their day. Judaism met Roman life and just bent itself accordingly. Israel and Judah are both fallen kingdoms at this point. So really, the temple was the only sign left, the only place where money and power could amass. The temple treasury was like its own small state economy. It was under Roman supervision, but the people allied with Rome and in charge of the temple were profiting greatly. Jesus is about to walk into this business as usual, and what he does will be the culmination of a lifelong obedience to God over every other force or power. We're ready to hear it, and I want to read it to us from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. After he looked around at everything, because it was already late in the evening, he returned to Bethany with the 12. The next day, after leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. From far away, he noticed a fig tree in leaf, so he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing except leaves, since it wasn't the season for figs. So he said to it, "No one will ever eat your fruit again." And his disciples heard it. They came into Jerusalem. After entering the temple, he threw out those who were selling and buying there. He pushed over the tables used for currency exchange and the chairs of those who sold the doves. He didn't allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And then he taught them, "Hasn't it been written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you've turned it into a hideout for crooks." The chief priests and the legal experts heard this and tried to find a way to destroy him. They regarded him as dangerous because the whole crowd was enthralled at his teaching. What a day Jesus just had. And what would it have been like to be there? This is a very different question than, and what do we think about it? Because we have an advantage here, an advantage/disadvantage of many, many years' distance from these recorded events. We mostly accept and enjoy the idea that Jesus tipped over some tables. We see that it needed to be done, and we're totally on board with just the kind of Jesus who'd get her done. In fact, modern Christianity has created a kind of mascot Jesus from this moment, one who turns over tables with us, conveniently, the very same ones that we would have flipped. That's usually how it works. But if I stop and think, what would it be like for me to live these events? God above, they must have been so disturbing, so confusing and confronting. I want to ask us, whose eyes could we look through in this one? What other perspective could we bring? Can we empathize with three very different perspectives? I have possibilities, and I invite you to keep going. First, what if we're the disciples on this day? It's pretty uncharacteristic for Jesus to curse trees. This is the only recorded case of that. But that walk into Jerusalem from the nearby village of Bethany includes the cursing of a fig tree. It does happen, and it must have drawn their attention. I think that's why it gets recorded. It was notable and strange. I think the disciples must have been on edge about Jesus' mood even before the main event. And then he throws out the merchants performing their usual services on an especially busy and important day with rowdy crowds and religious leaders and Roman soldiers all afoot. Mark doesn't add any dramatic flourish when he tells the tale, but what Jesus did had to look dramatic. He is pushing over tables. There are coins and doves scattering, flying through the air. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. That sounds like Jesus drawing on some internal authority to just halt business for the day. I don't really know how he got it done, but I believe that he could have. And I believe it probably surprised everyone. Don't we think he had to raise his voice just to be heard? No people were harmed in this act. It's very important to say. But the look and the sound of Jesus in those moments maybe seemed really alarming or a little bit unhinged. Were any of the disciples afraid of Jesus just then? Or were they afraid for him? If you raise his head up too high above the crowd. Were some of them ready for the revolution, already calculating where to go to get swords in the marketplace? And were some of them just backing quietly in the crowd, not wanting to be affiliated? I'm not a rabble-rouser. Just how split and confused must the disciples have been when Jesus destroyed the commerce of the temple in an act of protest, in an act of civil disobedience. That is also a very messy, very public lament. I wonder. And the next possibility, I wonder, what if we were the religious leaders in this one? Let's not call ourselves the bad guys, not yet anyway. Let's take that off the table. We're just guys in this one. We're just guys who understand our tradition and whose role it is to uphold that tradition. Are we not pretty alarmed and concerned by Jesus? Yeah, I think we are, because he is a disruption and a threat to the faith we hold. We don't know he's God's plan, but we know God. That's where we come from. We know God. And what we know does not line up with this guy. Not every religious leader was corrupt and on the take. A whole lot were. A lot were operating out of self-interest and not communal good. But some were just trying to hold fast to the faith of their fathers. I think we can respect that. It makes sense that plenty of very good people who'd been raised in a different system, who were operating with different instructions, could not get excited about Jesus, couldn't even see good in him. In fact, needed to actively resist and plot against him. Only problem is that Jesus was and is for real, and they just couldn't let themselves see it. The move Jesus made in the temple courts still applies. in all of our religious spaces, in our churches, in our common culture, in our institutions, in our think tanks. A whole lot of self-interest is still driving the institutions that were set up for communal good. And Jesus is still turning over tables that we set up and choose to man. We just can't always see it. One last possibility. What if we're the poor? This might be the most important perspective to consider in the whole story, because this is who Jesus acts for. Jesus is zealous for God's mission and God's presence to be fully represented on earth. Jesus wants people to see the place they assign to God as a place of prayer for all nations. That's what he quotes from the prophet Isaiah. Jesus will not stand by idly as the place assigned to God becomes just like any other man-made space, running on profit instead of compassion, kicking people out, denying their belonging instead of folding them in. And the people who receive the very least compassionate action in Jesus' day must have noticed what Jesus did there. I have to think that Jesus' protest didn't change the temple forever. I mean, I am certain that it did not change religion forever, because I'll note that we are here today sitting down in a Protestant denominational church because a bunch of later protesters boycotted the Catholic one for doing pretty much the same thing the temple merchants were doing here. The story repeats and repeats. One act of resistance didn't change the hearts of humankind. But I imagine that it did lift the hearts of the poor trying so hard to be faithful that day. Jesus is so upset by unjust access to God, by legal requirements, by norms and rules and barriers that preference the rich and disadvantage the least the most. So upset that Jesus walks right into the center of it all to exercise some superhuman authority against it, and then to make himself the target of its misused power. I believe one big reason Jesus takes action in the temple is to say, I see you. I see you taken advantage of and oppressed. I see you struggling with your faith in a world that's turned goodness into greed. I see you out there, and none of how you're being treated is okay. None of this is okay with me. You should know. Even if nothing else changed, even if the very next day the same tables are set back up and the same merchants are at work, wouldn't it be something? Might it be enough to make us think differently about our lives if we saw Jesus display that much emotion for us in absolute solidarity with us? Wouldn't we tend to feel a little more valuable just because we are seen? Wouldn't we feel that our lives are a little more significant in the world than they were a day ago? Wouldn't we have a little spark or a slightly larger flame that sits in us to say, no matter what the powers that be want us to feel, we have something more? Couldn't we just see more? Couldn't we all see more if we looked at ourselves through Jesus' eyes? A very deep injustice had been built in to the institution of faith by human beings who built the institution. And Jesus lamented that. Jesus lamented that injustice in public. It was such a powerful display that it hastened his arrest, his sham trial, and his execution. And what we see in this day will depend on the perspective we look from. The very good news I hear is that Jesus won't settle for being anyone's mascot. Not the temple systems, not any flawed religion, not even our own personal mascot. Jesus doesn't show up to keep us, his followers, perfectly comfortable and perfectly at ease. His will can frighten us. It can disorient us. It can certainly disrupt us. Because if there are sides to be picked, you can know the only side Jesus will choose is God's. And the very best good news of all, Jesus uses his biggest public acts to show us what God's heart wants. I think it's here today. I think it shows up on the cross. I think it shows up in resurrection. Jesus' biggest acts show us what God wants. And Jesus is still showing us that in the world. Acting out some days, protesting as a lament through his Holy Spirit and through people like you and me. I believe Jesus will keep at it until God gets all that God wants, which is nothing less than a world where we all belong. A world remade in the way of love over every other way. The invitation I hear now and in the weeks ahead is to watch what Jesus does. Let's see what Jesus does next as a model for the way he invites us all into.